Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Jackson Parr, originally from Elmhurst, Illinois. I'm a recent master's graduate and have been working with the UW-Madison Division of Extension as a research assistant in community and economic development as part of a team that includes Dr. Tessa Conroy. Our work focuses on the issues Wisconsin communities are facing, including our recent analysis of broadband. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Tessa Conroy, Assistant Professor and Economic Development Specialist at UW-Madison. Today, Tessa will be discussing broadband access in Wisconsin and how it supports economic well-being. Broadband improves business performance, farm profits, and is even linked to higher home values. Yet, despite the many benefits, access to high-quality broadband is limited in many communities throughout Wisconsin, which impedes progress toward rural prosperity. She'll discuss the challenges of and potential strategies for improving access. Tessa works in the Division of Extension and the Department of Agriculture and Applied Economics, where she studies community economic growth and development, small business dynamics, and entrepreneurs. Please welcome Tessa Conroy.
All right, thanks so much, Jackson. It's really good to be here with all of you today and be having this conversation about broadband. I know, throughout the state, so many are frustrated with their current service, and I hope that we can talk about that today, talk about why that is, and start to think about solutions as well. So here we have broadband and the Wisconsin economy. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about where this work comes from. So this work that I'll be presenting today is part of a series that we call the Wisconsin Economy. And in this series, we offer a data-driven report. So that's what you're seeing on the left, as well as a policy brief or sort of a strategy-oriented document. And then we have a series of fact sheets where we kind of take this information and put it into more bite-sized chunks. In addition to broadband, in the past, we've looked at manufacturing, we've looked at innovation, we've looked at job creation. So we try to tackle issues that we are all facing here in the Wisconsin economy. I had a great team to work with on this broadband report. I just want to acknowledge all my wonderful co-authors. We have Dr. Stephen Deller, another community development specialist here at UW-Madison, Matt Cures, a GIS specialist who made a lot of the beautiful graphics that are so informative and helpful. Dr. Sarah Lowe from the University of Missouri. Sarah has federal level experience thinking about broadband. It was really great to have her on board. Jeff Glazer, a lawyer, we had him helping us understand some of the regulatory or statutory questions around broadband. And then Gail Hike and Chris Stark, who are also part of Extension, a specialist and educator with their boots on the ground, working with communities that are struggling with broadband, working on expanding access. So I'm just really proud of the breadth of expertise that we were able to bring to this topic in the report. I want to talk a little bit about why we focused on broadband. So we knew that broadband was a challenge even before the pandemic. So with our 2018 data, we know that about 14% of households do not have a broadband subscription. And maybe that doesn't sound like a lot to you, but we're talking about, over 300,000 households that don't have a broadband subscription. So really quite a large segment of the population. And I think that we're starting to understand more clearly that broadband is much more than a modern amenity, that it is essential to our economic well-being. And I think that those challenges, what we're missing out on, has become more clear over the last year. So the challenge of going without broadband is more acute as we work from home. It affects our ability to set up at home, communicate with our colleagues, do the work that we need to do. Makes it more difficult for kids, for students to go to school, whether you're doing Zoom, trying to get lessons online, that becomes more challenging without adequate service. And even just to recreate, that there's some element of staying sane during the pandemic, staying at home, and our ability to watch a show, to communicate with our friends and family, to do our shopping, to be able to stay home, reduce our risk of exposure, is also connected to broadband. And then of course, telehealth. Perhaps we're getting our healthcare online as well, meeting with our counselors, meeting with doctors. So all of these things become now more evident during the pandemic, and it's just been easier to adjust, I would argue, for the people that do have it. And again, these economic costs of going without are just becoming more clear, and we'll talk more about these throughout the presentation. So I'll start off with a couple of basics. So what is broadband? You'll hear me say probably 25.3. So what that is referring to is broadband is defined by the Federal Communications Commission as 25 megabits per second of download speed and 3 megabits per second of upload speed. So 25.3, that is what broadband is. There are several different technologies available. So there are wired technologies, fiber, cable, DSL, and these are considered the faster sort of preferred technology. So broadband is arriving at your house via a hardwired connection. And then we call it wired, but even once it arrives at your home, you might be using a router to cast that signal across your house so you can still access it wirelessly, but you're getting it through a hardwired technology. And then we have wireless and satellite technologies. So this is what my parents have. There is a grain tower in their rural town where they get a wireless signal for their broadband service. And then we have satellite as well. These are generally viewed as slower and less preferred technologies. That said, they can be more feasible and work in communities with like difficult terrain, for example, and overcome some of those challenges. Another sort of just basic piece I want to put out there is you might hear me say ISP, and what that means, that is code for Internet Service Provider. So just some basic information here at the beginning. All right. So the next slide is just some basics on broadband infrastructure. So here we have a simplified graphic. So the first component of infrastructure is the backbone. So this is going to be the piece of infrastructure that connects between cities, for example. So going from Chicago to the Twin Cities. It's typically commercially owned or maybe by a government or academic institution or a provider. Typically fiber can move lots of information. And then that goes to middle mile infrastructure. So middle mile infrastructure is going to connect to neighborhoods within a city, so as well as anchor institutions. So that might go to a university, a hospital, government buildings, or get out to a neighborhood. And then it's the last mile of infrastructure that is the most challenging. So this is the piece of infrastructure that actually connects the middle mile to individual households and businesses. And this is where we start to see sort of the breakdown and where we run into households and businesses without service. So it's that last mile of infrastructure where we seem to have the most challenges. So with those basics in mind, let's now look at what service looks like in the US. So here we have broadband in the United States. So the share of the population with access to broadband, again, that 25.3 threshold by US county. In the darkest blue, these are places where close to 100% of the population has access to broadband. So we see parts of that, for example, in California, parts of that in Texas, a lot on the eastern seaboard. We have places with pretty good coverage. And then in the palest blue color, these are places where 2/3 or less of the population has access to broadband, so the least access. When we look at Wisconsin, you see quite a bit of variation. So Southeast Wisconsin has pretty good access, and then as we move north, we see less access. But compared to other states, I would say that we're about in the middle. Maybe not as good, for example, as Washington State or New York, but better than many states in the South. So landing perhaps about in the middle. If we take a closer look at Wisconsin, now we've moved from looking at things by county level to looking at things by census tract. So these are smaller units of geography. We can be a bit more granular, but you generally see the same pattern, that coverage, the access is quite good down in the southeast part of the state, and then generally not as good as we move north. There are pockets of generally more densely populated areas that have service, but I would say this map reflects, again, the experiences that we hear of residents sharing with us, kind of based on where they live, whether or not they do have access, and then also kind of mimics the distribution of population within the state. I think something to keep in mind that's important when we're looking at these maps is that this is access to broadband. So this is providers reporting that they can provide service to residents of a particular area. This doesn't tell us whether or not households are actually subscribing to service and what they have in their homes. And we also know from studying these data that it tends to overstate coverage. So we should be thinking about these maps as sort of an upper bound that kind of at most this is who has access. And I'll go into more detail about those data limitations later on. So we have here now the sort of flip side of thinking about internet access. So with these maps, we're going to be looking at what households have said. So rather than reporting by providers, this is reporting by households. So the share of households without internet access by US county. So again, we're flipping it in terms of who had access. Now we're going to look at who doesn't have access. And the darkest red, maybe more than a third of the population does not have access to broadband. And then in the palest colors, less than 15% are without access. And when you look at Wisconsin, you see that again, as a state, we're about maybe in the middle of the distribution, that there are places with a lot more dark red than what we have, so larger shares of the population without service. And then we have, though, other places that seem to have much better coverage. So again, this is just a different way of looking at it, where we're thinking about what have households said in terms of do they have internet at home versus what providers saying they can provide access in a particular area. So here, again, zooming in, looking with more granularity at Wisconsin. So looking by census tract. And we see sort of the complement to the pattern that we saw in the blue map. So, in the southeast part of the state, generally there are smaller shares of households that do not have internet access. And then as we move north, more dark red, indicating a larger share of households that is without internet access. What I want to draw your attention to in this map, though, is Milwaukee area. So even though this is a relatively urban area, and if we think back to the blue map, we saw that this part of Wisconsin had access, yet we still have fairly large shares of the population that say they do not have internet access in the home. So why is that? What is the disconnect here between the potential for access? So, supposedly these places have internet available, have broadband available, but then households do not have it in their home. So one potential explanation is affordability, that even though it's available, the price point is just too expensive for households in this region to subscribe. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. So let's change the visualization here of how we think about disparities in access to broadband in Wisconsin. So here we have a bar chart, and we're looking at US counties across the rural-urban continuum code. So there are 9 classifications. At the very bottom of the chart, we have the most urban counties. At the very top of the chart, we have the most rural, and then everything in between kind of going up and down that left side. Within each classification, we've broken down the share of households that do not have access to internet by income group. So in gray, we have the highest income, high income households, higher than $75,000 of income. And then in red, we're showing the other end of the distribution, households earning less than $20,000. And then we can look at the share that do not have access. So let's start at the bottom, looking at the most urban counties. We see that fewer than 10% of high-income households, or less than 10% of high-income households do not have internet. If we then go up to those most rural counties at the very top of the chart, that's about 15%. So we can kind of clearly see that rural-urban gap in service. And if we go then to the red bars looking at low-income households, again, we see a gap. So in the most urban settings, about 45% of those low-income households do not have internet, and then upwards of 55% in the most rural setting. So I think we can see that rural-urban gap, but what I think is striking about this graphic is that within any given classification, the gap between the high income and the low income households is even larger. So we have this sort of striking income gap component or disparity as well. So now that we've sort of seen what the lay of the land looks like in terms of broadband, I just want to consider these disparities or summarize a little bit for us. So there are still significant shares of the population without internet, depending on where we look. So we could look at various geographies, we could look by income level, but there are going to be segments of the population without service. Those are by rural urban, those are by income level. And I think what this points to are a few different challenges. So first, the need to address supply. Likely in the more rural areas, it's an issue of supply. The reason people don't have internet access or are not subscribing. And then there's also the need to address demand that I highlighted Milwaukee before. It seems to be the place that this is a region of the state that actually does have service, but households do not have internet, and that might be because of affordability. And it might also, though, be because of consumer preferences. Perhaps, they're just not willing to pay the price that it is given the value or relevance to their life. So there is this also component of stimulating demand. Maybe there is a need for education, helping people understand the benefit, how it can be useful to them. That educational component can also be part of expanding access. So already we're starting to see that probably solving, broadband access is multifaceted, that there is this infrastructure component, certainly, but build it and they will come is not enough. We'll have to also then think about affordability, think about stimulating demand. So how did we get here? We've laid out these disparities. We know a little bit now about what broadband looks like in the state. How did we get to this situation where we have, again, segments of the population without service? And I think the most sort of fundamental answer to that question is the high cost, that it's just expensive infrastructure to build. Whether you're, laying fiber, digging up the ground, stringing fiber across poles, that it's just expensive. Difficult terrain can make it cost even more costly. Perhaps if you're using some existing infrastructure, taking fiber across telephone poles, for example, companies might have to pay pole attachment fees. Those can range from $6 to $15 are the estimates that we saw per pole, 18 poles per mile. So these costs can accumulate relatively quickly. So it's just expensive. And then for an internet service provider, an ISP, they're going to be weighing those expenses against the potential consumers they might gain. So what does the population density look like? How many consumers might they gain from building that infrastructure? So in more or the relatively densely populated regions, those investments tend to make more sense. And this is also connected, of course, to take rates. So take rates is just, if we build this infrastructure, how many of the people here are actually going to subscribe to service? So a higher take rate is favorable for an ISP. It means more people are going to sign up. They'll have that revenue. They can weigh that revenue against the cost of building that infrastructure. So this high cost, low density environment of more rural settings is really challenging to make business sense for a private internet service provider. Just to give you, a rough example of what this looks like, to lay a mile of fiber technology might cost anywhere from $10,000 per mile. We saw estimates up to $85,000 per mile. So in a county like Richland County, which, if I'm remembering right, has about 30 people per square mile, if we're to take a low end estimate, let's say $12,000 per mile for fiber technology, 30 people per mile, I want to make sure I'm getting this right. About $400 then per person in terms of the expenditure cost. If we were to take that same $12,000 per mile and go to a county with, say, closer to 280 people per mile, like Outagamie County, then the cost per person for that infrastructure come down to about $50 per person. So, close to $400 per person versus close to $50 per person. So quite large differences in costs when we're looking at a relatively high versus relatively low density environment. And that just means that return on investment might not be there for the internet service provider. So that's some of the basics of how we got here, but there have also been a number of grant programs, a number of initiatives to expand service. We've seen a large amount of dollars going towards expansion, and certainly there's been progress. Certainly there have been gains in terms of broadband access, but maybe thinking about why might we have not gotten as far as we hoped with those initiatives. And the first answer to that question that I have is data limitations. So for a community or an entity to apply for a grant to expand access, it's pretty likely that they're going to have to demonstrate need in their community. So that might mean that they have to show that they do not currently have access. So what they'll likely do is use the same data that we used for the blue maps, where they're going to be looking for their community, do we have access or not? This data comes from the FCC. It's called Form 477. I mentioned it's provided by providers. So internet service providers are reporting. And the problem is that this data tends to overstate coverage. And the reason for that is because providers have to report whether they can or do provide service within a census block. So it's sort of generous in terms of what providers are reporting. And they get to say that they're providing service to a census block, even if only one location within that block has service. So we could have one household that a provider is serving, that area on the map is going to show up as served, even though 99% of households may not have service. So in that way, it tends to overstate coverage. It's also based on advertised speeds rather than actual speeds. So, a provider may provide speeds up to 25.3, but in reality, the experience of their broadband, the service they're actually getting is lower than that. So for those reasons, it can be really difficult to show need if we go to this map and it says, oh, my census block says it's covered and that we have quite good speed, but then the lived experience of residents of that place don't actually have that level of service. So it can be difficult to show need, and so it makes it difficult to apply and be competitive for grants. Luckily, we have the Data Act. The Data Act, which was passed in March of 2020 under the Trump administration. And what that does is mandate that the FCC basically take steps to improve the maps. Initially, there weren't many funds behind that act, but with the stimulus dollars now rolling out, there's money included in the stimulus funds for the Data Act. So hopefully we'll see those maps start to improve. I've heard, that this may take years. So it's unclear how long it will be before we have those better maps. And unfortunately, I think it just can't come soon enough. This is a really point of frustration for communities and a real challenge in terms of identifying where the work needs to be done. The grants and initiatives too might have additional data needs. We might need to know nearby providers. We might need to know about existing infrastructure. We don't want to duplicate infrastructure that's already out there. We might need to know who owns which pieces of land. We might need to think about zoning. So pulling together all of these pieces of information can be a large task. The applications can be limited to certain types of entities. So not just anybody can apply. You might need to find a partner service provider to consider these grants with you. Partnerships across regions can also be beneficial, but coordinating, seeking out those partnership agreements can be challenging. And then the applications can just be long and difficult for an entity to work through. I mentioned the data. They likely require a certain amount of technical expertise. They sort of touched on there's different technologies to think through, different types of infrastructure. Communities might need to provide a match, so figuring out financing and how you want to create a sustainable program. These can just be difficult. We've realized this, and the state, I think, has realized some of these challenges and the importance of technical assistance. So I just want to highlight, we do have from the Public Service Commission and WEDC, the Broadband Connectors Pilot, which is working on addressing this technical assistance component, making sure communities have what they need, the information they need to proceed with their plans for expansion. So another answer, I think, to the question of how did we get here is just that it's going to cost probably a lot of money. And I think there's certainly an argument to be made that we could have gotten further than we have with existing investments. There's an efficiency component. But I also just want to draw attention to the fact that when we compare the money we spent on broadband to analogous infrastructure, the highway system, electrification, the broadband spending so far has been relatively modest. We really spent quite a lot for comparable infrastructure if we look at highway and electrification. So just something to keep in mind in terms of what this might ultimately look like. The last answer we have to this question of, how did we get here? Why are we in this place where segments of the population don't have service? Has to do with municipal barriers. So in other states, and to some extent in Wisconsin, when we have areas that go unserved by commercial providers, then we might see cooperatives enter into the market, provide internet service, and also municipalities that can organize themselves in some instances to provide service. But some states have restrictions, statutory restrictions on these types of provisions. So in Wisconsin, we have a pretty robust cooperative provision of internet services, but we do have some limitations on municipalities' ability to provide broadband. So here's a map. There are close to half of states. We've seen states actually start to roll back some of these limitations, but close to half of states have some amount or some number, of barriers to municipal broadband. And some recent research from Brian Whitaker and Roberto Gallardo, really excellent paper showing that it does seem to be the case that these municipal restrictions do in fact amount to less access to broadband. And these can be, it's technically allowable in Wisconsin, but these can be feasibility study requirements. These might be restrictions meant to protect competition. So you have to make sure you're not competing with another entity. And so taken together, these statutes can make it really difficult to create a tractable strategy for a municipality to move forward. Okay, so with those challenges in mind, we know that there are parts of the state without service, and we also know that a little bit about why that is, several answers to that question. I also want to spend some time talking about what are the costs to the economy and community well-being of not having broadband. I think there are others, but I'm going to touch today on entrepreneurship, population and employment, education, and health. And I think taken together, again, it will just helps us make this point that broadband is much more than a modern amenity, that it has real quantifiable impacts that matter for our communities and for families in Wisconsin. So what are the costs? First, talking about entrepreneurship, and this is close to some of my own work and my own research, but we know that broadband is important for attracting new businesses, and a body of literature out here showing these types of effects. Important for fostering entrepreneurship, can even enhance farm profits, for example. Most recently, we've been able to show that there is more startup activity in places with greater access. The effect of having broadband on startup activity is even larger in the most remote and rural counties. So these places that are otherwise isolated, we see really almost extra importance of broadband for entrepreneurship. We also see larger effects for very small, so one man or one woman shops, these kind of individually owned types of businesses. We also see larger effects for women-led businesses. And I think that that's exciting because sometimes with our entrepreneurship initiatives, it's about high growth businesses. It's about businesses with a certain size or growth trajectory in front of them. And sometimes those businesses tend to be owned by white males. But when we look about broadband, there is a variety of businesses. This seems to be sort of good for everyone, and especially good for those small businesses, those women-led businesses where we have underrepresentation. And then In general, though, this link between broadband and entrepreneurship, though, is important because entrepreneurship is then linked to job creation. It's linked to income growth. It's linked to poverty alleviation. So when we think about coming out of the pandemic and we start to rehabilitate our communities, getting those jobs back, getting income growth back on track, entrepreneurship is going to be an important component of doing that. And it seems to be that we'll likely need broadband in order to support those entrepreneurs. Population and employment is another way that broadband is connected to community well-being. So what we find is a positive relationship between broadband access, population growth, and employment growth. But the population growth is the stronger relationship, I would say. And so it seems to suggest that people do have a preference for places with broadband. Dr. Steve Deller, a colleague, has shown that it is even reflected in housing values. So we see that rural houses that have broadband have higher value when they go for sale. So it does seem that people prefer to live in places with broadband. And that's important because more and more in economic development, we're seeing that jobs follow people. We used to think that people follow jobs, but now it seems to be the case that people identify a community, a quality of life, a lifestyle, and move to a location based on those preferences. So people are selecting their communities, and then employers are following. Employers are saying, oh, this community, this place, this region has a desirable pool of workers, potential workers, so I'm going to then locate my business there. So having this preference for broadband and having people move there is then potentially linked to where employers go as well. I will say, I think we need to think about COVID era shifts due to telecommuting, that this could be another opportunity for rural areas. I'm someone who's a bit hopeful of a rural renaissance, that we have workers who are now less anchored to their place of work and can live wherever they want. And then some of them might choose a more rural setting to relocate. And I think that as exciting as that is, the rural communities that have broadband are going to be at an advantage for attracting this now more footloose population. And this is just a graphic to help us visualize that relationship. So we have the broadband index on the bottom. So higher values of the index correspond to greater access. And then we see this positive slope or positive relationship between population growth and employment growth and each dot is a county. So just to give a sense of what this looks like. So another way to think about what are the costs. We know that there are better education outcomes in places with greater access. And we see this at different levels of education, starting with young kiddos, third grade reading scores, moving up to kind of think about high school age, ACT scores. And then when we look at the adult population in places with better access to broadband, a larger share of the population is going to go on to at least have some college. And while that's important for individual well-being and sort of their lifetime earnings trajectory, I think we want to also zoom out and think about this on a bigger scale, particularly with regard to COVID. So right now with COVID, we're starting to document, better understand what this means for student learning, that there are students with access to broadband, and then there are those that have broadband challenges or no access at all. Even we're hearing stories of parents driving their kids to McDonald's 40 minutes away so they can upload or upload their homework or get their next lesson done. So for students without the necessary broadband access, there's this now gap in learning, these missed skills. And that accumulates and plays out over time. So if there is a large segment of the population that isn't getting the quality of education as people with broadband, then there's less earnings. We have a less skilled labor force down the road. This has consequences for employers, and potentially then we all miss out on economic growth, economic well-being, just because we all do better when we have a skilled, well-trained workforce, and education is certainly part of that. So I have sort of a, provocative cover, but from McKinsey, kind of alluding to this, but, making that connection between, yes, this is consequential for individuals, but this also has broader consequences for what this means for our labor force going forward, what this means for employers. And here again, I just want to give a visual of what this looks like. So we see our broadband index on the bottom, and then the share of the adult population with at least some college, so getting some education beyond high school, and we see this positive relationship. So the last cost I want to talk about is health. And in our reports, we find better health outcomes in places with greater access. We look across two metrics. One is the percent of the population reporting poor or fair health. So in places with greater access to broadband, we see fewer people, or a smaller share of the population reporting, self-reporting poor or fair health for themselves. We also see fewer poor mental health days. So I can show you again what this looks like. You get this sort of negative correlation here. I'm showing you again that segment of the population that says they're in poor or fair health, and that percentage is smaller in counties with high access. I also, though, want to think about, a broader context here. So I'm learning about the social determinants of health, which would indicate that, yes, our health is attached to the care we get from our healthcare provider, but our health is largely determined by our social and economic context. So what is our living situation? What are our employment circumstances, our education income? Can we afford and access nutritious food? What kind of outdoor environment do we get to enjoy, and how that affects our health? And these are all considered the social determinants of health, all of these components. And broadband is viewed as, in some contexts, as a super determinant of health because it is connected to our education, as we just showed. It can be connected to our ability to seek and keep our jobs. It can be connected to our income level. So broadband having this connection to a number of the components that affect our overall health can also motivate thinking more seriously about broadband, understanding those very real consequences for folks. So with those economic costs in mind, I want to just close here by thinking about, well, what can we do about it? And I just want to start this by saying there really is a need for a breadth of strategies, that the challenges are going to vary for communities, from community to community, and the strategies then will also likely vary from community to community. So we've seen that in some places, broadband access is the key challenge. And in those settings, we might need to focus on infrastructure, just getting the service available to households. I also highlighted that places with access, according to the maps, may not actually have access. So we might need to address data quality. That might be sort of the first step, or the pre-solution that we need to come up with. And then broadband adoption. There might be some places that do actually have service available, but it's just not at a price point that is accessible to households that live there. So we might need to think about affordability. And then even if it is affordable, households have to want it. And so that could be through education and outreach that we're able to share with households, share with people how this can be useful and relevant to their life. This map, I think, captures the some of that variety of challenge and the necessity of a breadth of strategy. So here we're combining two different data sets, and I'll just highlight what I think are the most important takeaways from this map. So in blue, these are the places that have less access. So in dark blue, that's a lot of rural Wisconsin. This might be where we need to be thinking about infrastructure. Then in the dark red components, or the very darkest, maybe they look dark gray to some of you at home, in the very dark gray, these are places where the maps say there is access to broadband, but yet households aren't subscribing. So these might be the places throughout the state where we need to think more about affordability. It could also be, again, that data is not accurate. So we want to make sure that access is there kind of as it's being reported. But the affordability component could be part of it, as well as what we can do around education and outreach to support folks as they're learning how to use broadband, as we're all learning how to make the most of it. So in terms of addressing broadband access, so it's sort of, the first component that I mentioned, we see states adopting, I would say, 3 general strategies. The first is to have a state broadband program. So we have the Wisconsin Broadband Office in the Public Service Commission. And what these entities tend to do is communicate between the state and local stakeholders, between with tribal governments, with utilities, making sure everybody has the necessary, the correct information. Often these entities are engaged in planning, so coordinating efforts, and then also data management and improvement. So making sure, again, that we have the best data. We're seeing states adopt their own sort of data collection initiative. Georgia, Pennsylvania, these are states where they've sort of come to understand that the maps aren't best serving those communities that need to demonstrate need. So they've initiated their own methods, and some of those are outlined in the report for communities that are looking for ideas. And then also administering grants. Another general strategy is to focus on funding. So our resources point to about 57 federal programs to support broadband expansion. There's a database online, again, that's mentioned in the report if you would like to go shop through those programs and see which might be relevant in your communities or to your efforts. There are also state level grants and loans. And we're also seeing states address the funding component. How do we get money for broadband through tax incentives, through bonds, through specific purpose funds? So meaning, how do we set aside money for broadband so it's not competing for dollars against other needs in the state, against education or health, also worthy causes. And also seeing states engage philanthropists to expand coverage. So a number of different activities with regard to funding. A third component that we see states pursuing with regard to expanding access is considering alternative providers. So I already talked a little bit about municipally provided broadband. Not currently much of an option in Wisconsin, but we do see that as one vehicle for expanding access. Cooperatives, we have a number of cooperatives in Wisconsin engaged in broadband provision, and also exploring what anchor institutions can do. So we've seen, for example, in other states where a group of hospitals has gotten together and said, we're going to invest in the infrastructure, and then we're going to lease out unused capacity to the city or to a provider who can then provide service to households in our area. Getting broadband into the school, hotspot loaning programs through schools and libraries. I mentioned hospitals. We're seeing anchor institutions take a larger and larger role in terms of alleviating some of these challenges. Okay, so now thinking a little bit about adoption. So less than a quarter of federal spending on rural expansion has gone towards affordability and adoption. So we're mostly thinking about infrastructure. But as I mentioned, adoption is a big part of it. And certainly it's important for private investment. So we need people to adopt the service in order for it to be attractive for a provider, a business entity to come in to have it make sense for them. So we want to think about what we can do to encourage adoption and raise that take rate. Affordability is a component of that. I already mentioned we need assistance for households who could possibly utilize programs. So for example, there is the Lifeline program. This is a federal program where households can sign up and get a discount on their service. And that, to our understanding, is relatively underutilized. So maybe there is an opportunity for technical assistance to help people get that benefit, so that then maybe they would be able to subscribe for service. Paying attention to the cost of infrastructure. If we can keep infrastructure costs down, making sure we're not duplicating existing infrastructure, making sure that we have the right partnerships in place, we can keep those costs down, then maybe we can keep from having to forward on that expense to consumers. Thinking about competition and alternative models as well. Competition, economic theory would tell us, is going to have the effect of keeping prices down or bringing them down over time. In some places, it can be hard to have one provider, let alone even two providers. And so I think that's where exploring some of these alternative models, like a cooperative provider of broadband, might make some sense. Oftentimes, cooperatives have a pretty clearly stated mission of being oriented towards service of their members rather than profit maximization. That can amount to a different pricing structure. Similarly, when we've had anchor institutions get involved, something like a university, if they're oriented towards education, perhaps there's a different pricing schedule for people using their services for education versus general use. So exploring what kinds of partnerships and opportunities are available is also important. And then last, addressing preferences and willingness to pay, making sure people are using or are seeing how it can be useful to them, providing any coaching or education around digital literacy so that people are seeing the value and willing to sign up. Last, a couple considerations for success. We're definitely seeing at the local level a real need for designated leadership. It could be a person, a team, or an organization who is the local champion for expanding broadband. And to those entities, to whatever extent we can get technical assistance. So UW Extension's engaged in this. We know some state level entities engaged in supporting the technical assistance component. But as I mentioned, it can be quite difficult to apply for a grant. So making sure we have the resources available to that local champion so that they can continue to make progress on expansion. Partnership we have seen over and over again is just so important for communities to effectively expand access. So that can be partnership with a provider. So can you get together with the nearest provider or a willing provider, talk about what the challenges are, what makes sense, perhaps the entity that is applying, whether that's a municipality, even though they might not be able to provide service themselves, perhaps there's a way they can support service. Partnership with cooperatives in the same way, identifying what are the challenges, working together to remove obstacles, anchor institutions. I mentioned hospitals, schools, libraries, having them at the table so that these different groups can bring their resources, perhaps solve problems for each other. Partnering with other regions is also important because it has a way of aggregating demand. So if you bring together a large pool of people that need service, that can become more appealing to provider as well. Data alternatives, that if in a community you've identified that you need to come up with a better way to show need, there are surveys out there, examples of surveys where we can kind of keep track of what households are saying themselves in terms of service. We're starting to see more and more speed tests where you would access your laptop or your phone, send a signal to a sort of top level entity that's going to be collecting information for the region, and we can see what speed looks like across a region. So these are all things to keep in mind that have been helpful to communities expanding service. I'll close by saying that I think going forward, what I think one of my takeaways from this work has been, yes, infrastructure, and access and affordability and thinking about the consumer side. So we need to be considering the price point that we're offering service. It's not just enough to offer it. We have to also be thinking about, is this going to be affordable? And thinking about, do consumers want it? How can we support that demand side? Is it education and outreach? Is it a pricing program? How do we get the consumer side more engaged as well? I think that's going to be part of expansion. We have expanded telecommuting. This is, of course, on my mind. Is this an opportunity for rural communities, especially those with broadband, that we have people moving around? A lot of rural communities struggle with large outmigration, and is this an opportunity to offset some of that? But will we have to have broadband for that to work? And then last, I want to draw our attention to also be thinking about the adequacy of this 25-3. I think that the pandemic has highlighted that to have one or more professionals at home, one or more kiddos at home doing school 25/3 might really not be enough. Do we need to start thinking about even higher speeds as sort of essential for households to meet their needs? So with that, I'm happy to continue the conversation and take questions. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope it was worthwhile.
Tessa, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Fran Palaio-Moyer, Badger Talks producer. So broadband, when we scheduled this talk with you, I thought, okay, this is interesting. And you think of it as sort of, as a layperson, personally not having known anything about this topic, you really think about broadband as like, oh, cool, great media support. I can watch a lot of movies and now you've put it in this context of how it really is an essential element to our overall well-being. So thank you for sharing that with us. And it's really evident a lot of people understand that based on a lot of the comments coming in. And even prior to your event, we had a lot of discussion and comments out on Facebook. So I'm just going to share a couple of comments and a couple of questions that have come in with you. Alluding to what you talked about at the beginning, Carrie Espenson from Wapaka County says that her daughter and her husband live on their farm about 10 miles to the north of the county seat. Long story short, her and her daughter had to actually drive into town and sit in a parking lot as she was responsible for coordinating a Zoom meeting and couldn't afford to have it go out. So people obviously are struggling around the state with this. Katie Pata, as you were talking about sort of some cost analysis, she asked, curious to dig deeper on this. If broadband access is available and consumers are not opting in, why? Affordability is a likely presumption as mentioned, reliability, quality. I would be curious to survey households in the Milwaukee area to understand why consumers aren't subscribing. Any thoughts on that?
I agree. I think that that's a learning edge for those of us who are researching broadband, is understanding how people are using it. So, perhaps more and more we'll see people using it to get their health care. We might see, for example, we know that entrepreneurs are more likely to have home computers. So we might see people using it at home, or more likely to use internet at home if they have a business. Schooling from home now, of course, is becoming more relevant. So I think that's just a great insight in terms of, I think we need to understand how people are using it at home in order to understand what is their willingness to pay, what is their willingness to subscribe to service going to be. If they're just using it for entertainment, which I think is less and less likely, and then the willingness to pay might not be there, for example.
Good point. Nick Melchi just comments, waiting on Starlink because local providers aren't providing a viable solution in Southeast Wisconsin.
Yeah. My brother actually just got Starlink, and he has several kiddos at home doing their school. So it's been a solution for them, but I would just question the affordability. My understanding is that it's still around $99 per month, which is more expensive than I think $59 is sort of the average or the benchmark that I see. So in terms of getting perhaps low income households, I think Starlink has some potential. It seems like people are pretty happy with it, but for low income, it might still be quite a barrier.
Polly Cisco says, I live in Richland County with Frontier Telephone. I have internet, but it's slow and unreliable, constant outages. The cable is old GTE installed in 1972. I watch all the telephone co-ops installing. Oops, somebody commented and bumped me here. Hold on. She said, shoot, sorry about that.
That's right.
Can't the for-profit companies do the same? She said, I watch all the telephone co-ops installing fiber. Why can't the for-profit companies do the same?
Yeah, I think, there's probably a different answer for every provider. I imagine a lot of it does come down to just that return on investment for them. I can't say for sure. I would say one reason that cooperatives might be able to do it is they might have a little bit of cost advantage. So if they already own the poles, for example, so some cooperatives already own their electric poles, then they don't have to then pay the pole attachment fees because they own the pole. So they might have a cost advantage that makes it make business sense for them in a way that it doesn't for some other providers. But it's hard to say for sure.
Okay. Katie Pata also says, are we approaching a tipping point where broadband is seen as a public good the way roads, bridges, and electricity is?
Sure. So again, I would encourage folks who are interested, if you want to spend a bit more time, to look at the report, because we have this whole discussion in there of, should broadband be treated as a utility? And that's sort of a regulatory question, and that it really changes the dynamics of competition. But that argument is certainly out there, that broadband is becoming as necessity as, electricity or any other utility, and we should treat it as such. My sense is that hasn't really gone anywhere. We haven't seen kind of state and federal moves in that direction explicitly, at least not for some time. But you wouldn't be alone in thinking that. That's certainly the case.
We have another viewer, John Ike, who's made a couple of comments. And one comment he made was, if family income isn't high, they could prioritize phone subscription, which has internet access, over both phone and separate internet subscription. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would be curious to find out a bit more. I think in terms of accessing the internet on our phones, that's certainly one pathway. I don't know, though, we want to get households to a place where they can work from home, so I don't know that a telephone connection is going to be enough to do a Zoom call with multiple colleagues, or, to do a schooling lesson for kids at home. So I think that can certainly be helpful. I think we just need to think about, does that really provide the capacity that's needed for households to get the full benefits of having a broadband connection?
Thanks. Well, thank you so much. And we did have people asking for access to the PowerPoint and to the report. So can we post that in the Facebook event when we're done with the presentation here, Tessa?
Absolutely. If it's okay with you, I could put it in the chat right now.
Oh, sure. Great. And I'll post it out there. Excellent. Well, Tessa Conroy, thanks so much for your time today and sharing all of this great information with the people of our state. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really so glad to be with you all today. So take care.
Thanks. Everybody join us next week, Tuesday, March 16th at noon. We're going to be taking a little turn in the science arena, and we're going to be talking with NASA Earth and Space Science and Technology Fellow, Lena Vincent. She's going to be talking about the chemical origins of life on our planet and the potential for life on other worlds. Please visit badgertalks.wis.edu, where you can check out our upcoming schedule of weekly talks. You can join our email list to get notifications of our upcoming talks, or please consider making a donation to support future programming. And you can also host your own speaker for your upcoming events. So there you can request a speaker on our website and search through the 400 or so speakers that are signed up, willing to give talks around the state. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week, everybody.